The first report was written on a quiet afternoon in October 1998. It was not written by a priest, or a doctor, or a paranormal investigator. It was written by a primary school teacher who simply believed something about one of her students was deeply wrong. Her statement began with a single line. The boy did not behave like a child who was imagining things. He behaved like someone remembering something he should never have known. The boy's name was Daniel Harper. He was 6 years old, and according to the adults around him, Daniel had been speaking about another life since before he could properly read. At first, his parents believed it was nothing more than imagination. Children invent stories. They pretend to be pirates, astronauts, kings, and heroes. But Daniel did not pretend. He remembered. And what he remembered was terrifyingly specific. Daniel lived with his parents in a quiet town in northern Pennsylvania. His father, Michael Harper, worked long hours as an electrician. His mother, Laura, stayed home and cared for Daniel and his younger sister. The Harpers were not religious extremists, nor were they particularly superstitious people. They attended church on holidays. They lived ordinary lives. And for the first few years of Daniel's life, nothing seemed unusual. According to Laura Harper's later testimony, the first strange moment occurred shortly after Daniel's 4th birthday. It happened late one evening while she was tucking him into bed. The house was quiet. The hallway light spilled gently into the room. Laura pulled the blanket up around her son and leaned down to kiss his forehead. That was when Daniel said something that made her pause.
He spoke calmly,
almost thoughtfully. "Mom," he said, "this room is different." Laura smiled gently. "Different from what?" Daniel stared at the ceiling for a moment. Then he replied in a voice that sounded strangely distant. "From my other house." Laura assumed he meant a game. Children often imagine other homes or secret places. So she played along. "What other house?" Daniel turned his head toward her. His expression had changed. It was no longer playful. It was serious. "The one where the stairs were broken," he said quietly. "The one where the man pushed me." Laura froze. For a moment she thought she had misunderstood. "Pushed you?" she asked. Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes." "Who pushed you?" The boy's eyes drifted toward the dark hallway outside his room. And he whispered something that his mother would later repeat dozens of times to investigators. He didn't want anyone to know. Laura told her husband about the conversation the following morning. Michael Harper laughed. He said Daniel must have seen something on television, or heard older children telling stories. But Daniel continued talking about the other house. Over the next few weeks, he mentioned it repeatedly. Sometimes during dinner. Sometimes while playing. Sometimes in the middle of the night. His descriptions became increasingly detailed. He spoke about a narrow staircase that creaked when people walked on it. He described a window that overlooked a small alley behind the house. He spoke about a dark room where someone used to lock him when he misbehaved. At first, the Harpers tried to ignore it. But then Daniel began saying something even more disturbing. He claimed the house was not imaginary. It was where he lived before he was born. According to Laura Harper's written account, the conversation that truly frightened her happened 3 months later. It was early morning. Daniel had just finished breakfast. His sister was watching cartoons in the living room. Laura was washing dishes when Daniel walked into the kitchen and sat quietly at the table. For several minutes, he said nothing. Then he asked a question. "Mom, do you know what happens when someone dies?" Laura dried her hands slowly. "Why are you asking that?" Daniel looked at the floor. "Because I remember." The room fell silent. Laura pulled out a chair and sat across from him. "What do you remember?" Daniel spoke in a calm voice. Too calm for a 6-year-old child. "I remember the stairs," he said. "I remember falling." He paused. Then he corrected himself.
"No.
I remember being pushed." Laura felt a cold sensation move slowly through her chest. "What do you mean pushed?" Daniel looked up. His eyes were strangely focused. The man was angry. "Why?" "Because I told someone what he did." Laura's hands began to tremble. "What did he do?" Daniel stared directly at her. And then he said something that would later appear in the teacher's report, the church documents, and the medical evaluations. He hurt the little girl. At that point, Laura Harper became convinced something was wrong. Not supernatural, but psychological. She assumed Daniel had overheard something disturbing somewhere. Perhaps a news report. Perhaps a conversation between adults. She scheduled an appointment with a child psychologist. Dr. Martin Reynolds met Daniel 2 weeks later. The evaluation lasted nearly an hour. According to Dr. Reynolds' professional notes, Daniel did not appear confused or delusional. He answered questions calmly. He displayed no signs of hallucinations. And when asked about the other house, Daniel gave an answer that made the psychologist pause his recording device. Daniel said the house was located near a railway bridge. He described the street name. He described the color of the door. And he described the man who lived there. The psychologist wrote a single sentence in the margin of the report. Child speaks with unusual certainty about events he could not have personally experienced. But the strangest detail had not yet appeared. Because Daniel did not only remember the house.
He remembered the man.
The first time Daniel described him clearly, it happened at school. His teacher, Mrs. Catherine Doyle, had asked the class to draw pictures of their homes. Most children drew simple houses with bright roofs and trees. Daniel's drawing looked different. His house was dark. The windows were shaded. And standing beside the building was a tall figure with no face. Mrs. Doyle knelt beside his desk. "Daniel, who is that?" The boy answered without hesitation. "That's him."
Who?
"The man who pushed me." Mrs. Doyle assumed Daniel was describing an imaginary villain. But then she noticed something strange in the drawing. Daniel had drawn the staircase. And at the top of the stairs, he had drawn a small stick figure. That figure was falling. Mrs. Doyle gently asked him about it. Daniel spoke quietly. "I fell there." "Did you get hurt?" Daniel shook his head slowly. "I died." Several students nearby heard the conversation. Within hours, the story had spread throughout the classroom. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Doyle wrote the report that would eventually reach the local church. Her final sentence read, "The child speaks about his death as if recalling a memory rather than inventing a story." The Harpers tried to stop Daniel from talking about it. They told him the memories were not real. They asked him to focus on school. For a short time, the conversation seemed to stop. Then the nightmares began. Laura first noticed them during the winter. Daniel started waking up screaming in the middle of the night. At first, he could not explain what he had seen. But gradually, he began describing the dream. It was always the same. He stood at the top of a staircase. Someone was behind him.
A man.
He could hear breathing. Heavy breathing. Then the man spoke. "You shouldn't have told." And then the push came. Every time. The same push. The same fall. And the same terrifying silence before he woke up. 3 weeks later, something happened that made the Harpers contact the church. Daniel began speaking in his sleep. Laura heard it one night while passing his bedroom. At first she thought he was talking in a dream. But the words sounded unusual. They were not childish. They were angry. And they were directed at someone. Laura opened the door quietly. Daniel was sitting upright in bed. His eyes were closed. But his voice was clear. "You lied." He paused. "You said you wouldn't hurt her again." Another pause. Then his voice dropped to a whisper. "You killed me." Laura rushed to his bedside. "Daniel, wake up." The boy's eyes opened slowly. For a moment, he looked confused. Then, he asked a question that chilled her completely. "Did he come back?" Laura felt her breath stop.
Who?
Daniel looked toward the dark corner of the room. And he answered in a quiet voice. "The man from the stairs." Within 2 weeks, the Harpers requested help from their local parish. They did not ask for an exorcism. At least not at first. They simply asked a priest to speak with their son. Father Thomas Gallagher agreed to visit the house. According to church documentation, Father Gallagher expected nothing more than a frightened child with a vivid imagination. But during the interview, Daniel said something that made the priest slowly remove his glasses and place them on the table. Daniel looked at him carefully. Then, he asked a question. "How old are you, Father?" The priest smiled politely. 58. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. Then, he said something no one in the room understood. "You look older than the last priest." Father Gallagher frowned. "What last priest?" Daniel leaned back in his chair. "The one who came to the house before." What house? Daniel's voice became quiet again. The house where I died. Father Gallagher wrote several pages of notes after that conversation, but the final line of his record would later become the most disturbing. The child described a murder that occurred 32 years before his birth. And according to Daniel, the man who pushed him was still alive. And he was getting closer. The priest realized something then. Something he could not explain. Because the boy had just described a location that matched a real house. A house connected to an unsolved case from 1966. And the moment Father Gallagher heard the address spoken aloud, the temperature in Daniel's bedroom suddenly dropped. And the boy slowly turned his head toward the door. As if someone else had just entered the room. Father Thomas Gallagher later stated that the temperature shift was sudden and unmistakable. Moments before, the room had been warm. The Harper's old radiator clanked softly in the corner, pushing out steady heat. Then, without warning, the air felt thin and cold. Not like a draft. Not like a window had opened, but like the warmth had been pulled out of the room. Daniel's eyes moved slowly toward the doorway. The hallway beyond was dark. No one stood there. Yet the boy stared as if someone had quietly arrived and was now watching. Laura Harper felt the same strange sensation spreading across the back of her neck. She turned toward the hall. "Michael," she called softly. Her husband answered from the kitchen. "I'm still downstairs." Father Gallagher watched Daniel carefully. "Daniel," he said calmly, "why are you looking at the door?" The boy's expression tightened. For a moment he did not answer. Then he spoke in a quiet voice. "He followed me." The priest leaned forward slightly. "Who followed you?" Daniel did not take his eyes off the hallway. "The man." Laura felt her chest tighten. "What man?" Daniel swallowed. "The one who pushed me." The room fell silent. Father Gallagher stood slowly and walked toward the doorway. He looked down the hallway. The house was quiet. Nothing moved. Still, the priest closed the bedroom door gently before returning to his chair. He wrote something in his small leather notebook. When he finished, he asked Daniel another question. "Daniel, do you remember the man's name?" The boy nodded. "Yes." "What is it?" Daniel hesitated. His lips parted slightly. Then he whispered a name. The priest did not react immediately, but his hand tightened around the notebook. Because the name Daniel had just spoken was not unfamiliar. It was the same name mentioned in an old parish record connected to the house he had described earlier. A record from 1966. A record involving a young boy who had died after falling down a staircase. The death had been ruled an accident, but the file had always contained a strange note written by a local officer. A note that simply read, "Possible push. No witnesses." And the man Daniel had just named had lived in that house. Father Gallagher asked the Harpers if he could return the following day. They agreed immediately. That night, however, the situation changed. Laura Harper woke at 2:17 in the morning. At first she did not know why. The house was silent. Then she heard something faint. Footsteps. Soft, uneven steps moving slowly along the hallway outside the bedroom. Her heart began to pound. She nudged her husband awake. "Michael, do you hear that?" He listened. The sound came again.
A slow step.
Then another. Michael sat up. "Daniel," he called quietly. No answer. The footsteps stopped. Michael climbed out of bed and opened the door. The hallway light was off, but he could see Daniel standing near the top of the stairs. The boy faced the staircase, his small body perfectly still. "Daniel," Michael said softly. The boy did not move. Michael walked toward him. "Buddy, what are you doing out of bed?" Daniel spoke without turning around. "He's standing there again." Michael frowned.
"Who?"
Daniel slowly lifted his arm and pointed down the staircase. "The man." Michael looked down. The stairs disappeared into darkness. Nothing stood there. "Daniel, there's no one." Before he could finish, the boy suddenly staggered backward. His heels slipped on the edge of the top step. And for a terrifying moment Michael thought his son was about to fall. Michael grabbed him instantly and pulled him away from the staircase. Daniel's breathing became fast and shallow. "He pushed me again," the boy whispered. Michael carried him back to bed. But neither parent slept for the rest of the night. Father Gallagher returned the next afternoon. He brought a folder of documents from the parish archives. Inside was a newspaper clipping from May 1966. The article was small, buried near the bottom of the page. It described the death of a 9-year-old boy named Samuel Keene. Samuel had fallen down the staircase of his home and died from head injuries. The article called it a tragic accident, but the priest pointed to another name in the report, the homeowner, a man named Harold Whitaker, the same name Daniel had whispered. Laura read the clipping slowly. Her hands trembled. "You think our son remembers this boy?" Father Gallagher answered carefully. "I don't know what your son remembers, but what he described matches this case." Michael leaned back in his chair. "That's impossible." The priest nodded slowly. "I agree." Yet something else in the file was even more disturbing. Samuel Keene had been living temporarily with Whitaker. His parents had died earlier that year, and according to an old police note, neighbors had occasionally reported hearing arguments inside the house. The file ended abruptly. No charges. No investigation beyond the accident report. The case had been forgotten. Until Daniel Harper began describing it 32 years later. That evening, Father Gallagher decided to speak with Daniel alone. He asked the parents to wait in the living room. Daniel sat quietly at the kitchen table. The priest placed the newspaper clipping in front of him. "Do you recognize this boy?" Daniel studied the photograph. It showed a thin child with dark hair and serious eyes. After several seconds, Daniel nodded. "That's me." The priest watched him carefully. "Do you remember your name?" Daniel's answer came immediately. "Samuel." A long silence followed. "Samuel what?" the priest asked. "Samuel Keene." The priest felt a chill move through him. "Daniel, how do you know that?" The boy looked confused. "That's what my mother used to call me." "Your mother now?" Daniel shook his head.
No.
"The other one." The priest closed the folder slowly. "What happened in the house, Daniel?" The boy's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "He didn't like me." "Why not?" "Because I told people what he did." "What did he do?" Daniel lowered his voice. "He locked the girl in the basement." The priest's eyes narrowed slightly. "What girl?" "The little one." Daniel looked toward the floor. "He hurt her." The room became very quiet. "Did you tell someone about it?" the priest asked. Daniel nodded. "Yes." "And then?" The boy swallowed hard. "Then he found out." Over the next few days, Daniel's memories grew clearer. Too clear. He described rooms in the old Whitaker house. A narrow kitchen, a cracked window near the back door, and a locked basement door that smelled like damp wood and rust. The priest contacted the local historical records office. What he learned disturbed him even further. The Whitaker house still existed, and Harold Whitaker had lived there until 1978. Then he had sold the property and moved away. There were no records of his death, which meant one possibility remained. If Daniel's memories were true, the man who had pushed Samuel Keene down the stairs might still be alive. But something else began happening inside the Harper home. Something that had nothing to do with memories. Daniel started seeing the man. Not in dreams. Not in stories. But inside the house. The first time happened 3 nights after Father Gallagher's visit. Laura heard Daniel speaking softly in his bedroom. She assumed he was talking in his sleep again. But when she opened the door, Daniel was sitting upright and staring at the corner of the room. His eyes were wide, and he was whispering, "You're not supposed to be here." Laura followed his gaze. Nothing stood in the corner. "Daniel," she said gently, "who are you talking to?" The boy's voice trembled. "Him." Laura's stomach tightened. "What does he want?" Daniel did not answer immediately. He continued staring at the empty space. Then he whispered something that made Laura step backward. "He says I shouldn't have come back." Father Gallagher was called again the following morning. After listening carefully, the priest spoke with unusual seriousness. "I believe we may be dealing with more than memory." Michael crossed his arms. "You're saying our son is possessed?" The priest shook his head slowly.
No.
"Then what?" Father Gallagher paused. "Something connected to the past may be attached to the boy." Laura looked terrified. "You mean the man?" The priest hesitated before answering. I'm not certain what it is. But if Samuel Keene died violently, and if the truth about his death was never revealed, he closed his notebook. Then it's possible something unfinished followed the child. Michael rubbed his forehead. This doesn't make sense. The priest nodded.
No.
It doesn't. But the events that followed would make even less sense. Because 2 nights later, something happened that forced Father Gallagher to contact the diocesan office. Daniel woke up screaming again. But this time the nightmare was different. When Laura ran into the room, Daniel was standing on the bed. His eyes were open, but he was not looking at her. He was staring at the ceiling and speaking in a voice that did not sound like a 6-year-old child. You left her there. His small hands clenched tightly. You locked her in the dark. Laura grabbed his shoulders. Daniel. The boy's head turned sharply toward the bedroom door. Then he shouted a sentence that no one in the house understood. A sentence spoken in a tone filled with rage. I told them what you did, Harold. The room fell silent. Daniel collapsed onto the mattress, his body suddenly limp. When Father Gallagher arrived later that morning, he listened carefully to the parents' account. Then he opened the old case file again. And for the first time, he noticed a small handwritten note that investigators had apparently overlooked decades earlier. A neighbor had once reported hearing a child crying in Whitaker's basement. The report had never been followed up. Father Gallagher looked at Daniel. The boy sat quietly, exhausted, staring at the floor. And the priest realized something deeply disturbing. Daniel might not simply remember Samuel Keene's death. He might remember something else. Something no one had ever discovered. And if that was true, then whatever was visiting the Harper house at night might not be Samuel at all. It might be someone who had been waiting 32 years for the truth to be revealed.